literally starved my body because I exercised so much whilst I was growing. He basically said that if you forget about this calorie in, calorie out model, it all comes down to one single hormone. When you actually look at the science and the physiology and the pathophysiology behind it makes sense. Welcome to the Zest Method channel. I'm Amelia, an ex-army doctor and founder of a preventative medicine coaching business called, you guessed it, the Zest Method. I have an insatiable curiosity about the subconscious mind and self-betterment, and so I'm hoping to, through this medium, share what I learn and hopefully help humans feel better, not perfect. Episode 13, Eat Less and Work Out More. A theory or model which I think is completely flawed because I experienced it myself. So today's episode is almost following along from the previous episode 11 and 12, part 1 and part 2 with Dr. Lamia Safrani, who touched upon relative energy deficiency in sport, which is effectively what you're saying is that mainly with women and some men in sport, when they're really at their elite level, that when calories going out over a long time exceeds the energy coming in, you start getting a deficiency in energy. And because us females are very sensitive when it comes to hormones, periods stop or become irregular, etc. And that can have long-term consequences if the period doesn't come back. And we touched upon the fact that I probably either have had REDS or currently still in REDS because of age 15 to 21 had, unfortunately, an eating disorder, which I'm not really going to delve into. Not really that necessary. It's just a bit sad and I'm annoyed at myself that I did it. But I think this episode I will just explore the fad diet, the yo-yo dieting that I've gone through to show that although I stand here talking about preventive medicine and nutrition and like I know it all, I really don't. And it's been like a 17-year journey where I can now comfortably say that I've finally reached the maintenance phase, whatever that means, and feel far more relaxed around food and actually don't crave necessarily the bad stuff and seeking out the good stuff just simply by choice, not because I have to, which is a lovely feeling, but I'm not by any means a finished product, and it's taken such a long time to get there and been a very tumultuous journey. So that's what I've chosen to speak about today. Disclaimer, if I look horrendous, by the way, it's because I had Pride on the weekend and then a wedding, so I'm shattered. And if I'm not able to articulate myself as well as I normally do, that'll be why. Okay, so went from almost being undernourished for several years, literally starved my body because I exercised so much whilst I was growing, to then being overnourished, but overnourished in a malnourished way. And what I mean by that is when you deprive yourself of food for so long, that eventually when you decide to no longer do that, which luckily I was able to come out of the eating disorder by myself, I just suddenly one day woke up, I thought, I've had enough. So I'm going to change. I'm going to eat more. But it wasn't done in a controlled, measured way. That once you start saying yes to food, it opens the floodgates. And then I established a lack of control. And then that migrated into binge eating, which was sort of feast and famine, where you then just can't control at buffets where, oh God, I mean, I just remember thinking out like panic, but also, what's the word? Exhilaration? Something like that. All in the same sort of experience where I was like, I can't say no to all this food, to the point where you're so full, and then you have this sort of thoughts of guilt and shame, so you think, well, I can't eat anything now, so then you go and sort of starve yourself again, and so your body thinks, oh no, it's going back to where you were, so then it stores and holds on to it, and then you get really hungry and your ghrelin, the hunger hormone, goes up, and then it's just this vicious cycle, which went on all the way through university, coupled with me starting to drink, enjoy alcohol, the late night kebabs, takeout. You're like, oh, on Monday I'll start again. And I just remember being trapped in this awful loop for years where I constantly was dieting, constantly hungry. You got to the point where it was so strict that a treat would be bubble gum flavoured chewing gum at 9 with a cup of tea before I went to bed, just because I just sort of satiate the hunger. And when they say on these adverts or podcasts, etc., that ultra-processed food is an addiction in itself, it actually is. And I experienced that also, where they taste so good that Pringles. Who has ever had one Pringle? No one. Because they're just so moreish. And then because you get addicted to the sugar, I'm not even talking in puddings or snacks, but obviously it's laced in all ultra-processed food packaging or meals or even savoury foods, that you then just crave it all the time. And apparently it takes 3 days to cook the... can't speak. It takes 3 days to kick sugar craving. I would argue it takes a lot longer than that. And I just went from fad diet to fad diet. Even tried Slimming World, Weight Watchers, or collecting the points. I mean, it's just such almost like a weird chapter of my life where it just was really, really horrible and didn't feel in control. I didn't necessarily like the way my body was, because you then went from being so slim to then actually overweight. It was just a really, really awful, awful time. And the information out there is always so confusing. And I think, look, like a new diet or fad that looks new and shiny, you naturally, that's how they work. You gravitate towards it and try it. And I'm just going from one thing to the next. So any fad diet out there, I've been there and tried it. And I can tell you, they don't work. Because it's all based on this model of eat less and just burn more calories. And it's simple. That works. Tried and tested. All the personal trainers will tell you that. You'll just lose weight. But as we'll explore shortly, that actually sort of isn't the case. So the next chapter I went into was macros. And again, that's applied some structure, routine, control into how you should set about each day, obtaining the right amount of protein, carbs and fats. And I went to a couple of personal trainers during my university spell, and they would say on a rest day, when you're not doing any exercise, your BMR, basal metabolic rate, which is the number of calories you burn just to merely stay alive, is 1,300 calories. And then when you do exercise, and you're probably going to burn X amount in the gym, but we're on the cutting, not maintenance yet, then just increase it to the dizzy heights of 1,500. And so I did that for a good 2 years. And it did work, that I did lose weight to the point where I was thinking, I look great, I look fab. But then a new problem presented itself, where the 1,500 calorie ceiling is actually very low. When you go to a restaurant or you go away for a weekend, a barbecue, especially in the summer, heat wave, you can't necessarily calculate what that's going to be in that meal, but even a slab of halloumi is probably going to tip you over. And I just found I then felt very trapped in this calculator, MyFitnessPal app. And what made me perhaps see the light, or almost kicked me out of this then stage, was, well, when I started dating, this is years ago now, so she was a really, really good chef. And I just thought to myself, I literally cannot imagine being asked to go around to hers. She cooks me this lovely meal, and I ask her what all the ingredients are within that meal, all the components. Can she please tell me those components so I can type it into my MyFitnessPal? And even I gave myself the ick thinking about asking her that question. I was like, this is just no life. I literally feel imprisoned by this app. $1 per mayo, I wonder how much that is on the scales. And we've all been through it. I'm not going to speak for everyone, but a lot of us have done it. And it serves a purpose in giving you a rough idea as perhaps how much you're eating. But I just, again, felt just so tied to, again, another fad diet. And I was still a little bit hungry, but I justified it by saying, well, it worked and I look great. So that then led me to reading this wonderful book, which I alluded to in the previous episodes, Obesity Code. Dodgy title, not too sure I'm keen on that one, but it's by Dr. Fung, who is a nephrologist. A nephrologist is someone who studies kidneys. And kidneys is one of the organs that is severely damaged by diabetes. Now, we're all familiar with diabetes, type 1, type 2. They even say diabetes type 3 is synonymous with Alzheimer's, but we're not going to talk about that today. But essentially with diabetes, the pancreas, which produces insulin, is triggered every time you have sugar, because sugar circulating around the blood for a long period of time isn't good for the vessels. It causes micro damage, and eventually it starts to cause neurological symptoms or amputations or kidney disease, retinopathy, so blindness, because the sugar damages the lining of these small vessels that supply these vital organs. And so in his book, he basically busted so many myths about if you eat less and burn more, you'll lose weight. And for me, it was a real eye-opener, because the first time I kind of saw the light at the end of the tunnel, I was like, oh, maybe this is the key, and why is no one speaking about it? This is fundamental and quite obvious, but this is huge news. And it was over Christmas, of course, the glutton stage, and I was sort of devouring my Christmas cake and sipping champagne whilst I was eating this book. But it was great timing, because okay, right, in January I'm going to start this new thing, and it didn't feel like a fad this time. I mean, maybe I'm just justifying it to myself, but the physiology behind it, having studied medicine, it did actually make a lot of sense to me, which is why it really resonated. Essentially, I'm going to probably do a really bad job now, because I read it 5 years ago, and I probably should have read it again before I came on this podcast, but let's test my memory recall, shall we? So, you have insulin that is released, that when there are sugar cubes going around your vessels, insulin then basically taps into your liver cells and muscle cells to stimulate them to absorb the sugar and take it out of your blood vessels, so that your blood glucose levels drops. And as you can imagine, every time you eat, blood sugar levels rise, and so does the insulin levels. And over time, if you start having more and more sugar, obviously more and more insulin is released. So cells take up more and more sugar. And at some point, some of these organs and cells get saturated with sugar. There's simply no more sugar that they can absorb. So as a consequence, the pancreas pumps out even more insulin to basically get these cells like shoving the sugar inside the cells, even though they can't take any. So eventually, once the muscles are saturated, then it goes to the liver, and then it starts going to other organs. And that's what then leads to something called visceral fat, which is fat around your organs. So I don't know if you've ever heard of people who are pear shapes or apple shapes. So people who are apple shapes tend to be more men, and that's because if they have more sort of belly fat or a bit of a gut, it represents a more unhealthy distribution of fat. It signifies more visceral fat, which is the bad fat. Whereas women, we tend to put it on our ass, thighs, I sure as hell do, and that's like the healthier, because that's going into adipose rather than your going into adipose cells rather than around your organs. That's like a real generalization, sweeping statement, but that sort of is the general concept anyway. And so because you've got even more insulin going around, it's a bit like a drug. If you have too much alcohol, you start having too many drugs, you start getting resistance to it, or antibiotics, all the same. So there's no difference with hormones. When you start pumping around your body way too much insulin, your body starts getting resistant to it. And so the start of prediabetes and then diabetes, type 2, I'll be very clear. Type 1 is when you have no insulin in your body at all, and is life-threatening if you don't get insulin ASAP. But type 2 diabetes is when you start getting insulin resistant. And eventually the cells really can't take up any more sugar as a response, despite the amount of insulin circulating in your body. And that's when sugar remains in your blood for a longer period of time and starts to cause that damage in the vessels I alluded to earlier. He basically said that if you forget about this calorie in, calorie out model, it all comes down to one single hormone, insulin. And essentially, if you want to get healthy, lose weight, all you need to do is reduce insulin. Because you see, insulin is almost a barometer for body weight. If you imagine a room thermostat, the thermostat, if it's set to a certain temperature in the room, if the room suddenly gets too hot, it'll naturally send more AC into the system to cool it down, or if it starts getting too cold and the thermostat drops, then the thermostat kicks into central heating to bring up the temperature. So exactly the same with insulin, that if forgetting sort of modern Western diets, we all have a natural body weight that we are just naturally meant to be, that no matter how much you exercise or don't eat or how much you eat, you naturally should gravitate around a particular kilogram, plus or minus a few. And so that is almost your room thermostat. And in order to dial it up or dial it down, you need to obviously use insulin in your favour. And so then I started thinking, okay, I wonder what the factors are to increase insulin, and equally, what are the factors that decrease insulin? Because I'm constantly in this sort of battle. And the obvious ones for insulin being increased would be your sugar, your ultra-processed food, but also things like stress is a huge one, or your chronic sleep deprivation. Those are all real contributing factors to spiking your insulin, along with all the other deleterious hormones. But then conversely, to drop insulin, you either eat foods that don't spike your insulin, or you fast and don't eat anything at all, apart from clear liquids such as water, black coffee, black tea. Obviously, Sprite is a clear liquid, but that doesn't count. And actually, fun fact, the reason being is everyone probably has heard of the glycemic index, which is every food has a glycemic score based on glycemic load. That if it's really, really high in sugar, it'll have a high glycemic index because it's going to spike your glucose quite high. And then you've got some foods that are really, really low on the glucose spectrum. So, for example, avocados won't have any sugar compared to your frosted shreddies, my favourite. And then what people are less familiar with is the insulin index. So usually a lot of foods will correlate with insulin and the glycemic index. So what tends to score highly with glucose tends to have a matching amount of insulin to release to bring it back down again. However, when you come to sodas, so full-fat Coke or Diet Coke, there actually is a difference. And so when they're saying, there is such thing as a free lunch, it doesn't actually exist. That when you're drinking Diet Coke, fair enough, if you prefer the taste of Diet Coke to full fat. Because actually, not that I actually drink sugary drinks anymore, it's too sweet for me. But the Diet Coke has a slightly more sort of savoury taste. So if I'm ever going to have a soda, I know I'm not American, but let's just call it soda, I'll have a Diet Coke that tastes better compared to full fat, which just feels so sugary. Whereas some people, they actually secretly prefer full fat, but they think, I better go for the 0 calorie on because that one's better for me. So that's not true. Both are just as bad for you. So if you actually genuinely prefer full fat versions, go for that one because they're having the exact same impact on your body. And the reason is that on the glycemic index, your full fat Coke will score 100%, or very close to. However, on the and then the Diet Coke on the glycemic index will be 0 or much, much lower because it's all artificial sweeteners, so you're really low sugar, low calories. However, on the insulin index, both will spike high. So when you drink your full fat Coke, sugar is triggered into the system, which means pancreas release insulin. Insulin is released to reduce the blood glucose in your system. Whereas when you have a Diet Coke, even though it's just artificial sweeteners, your tongue will and the salivary amylase, etc., will still pick up sweetness. So it will release insulin from your pancreas anyway. And as we know, with insulin, when it's going up, that's a barometer for body weight. So I don't know whether that makes sense. It's a really sort of long fact, which actually is probably not fun at all after all that. But basically, in summary, if you want full fat, just have it, because don't kid yourself with Diet Coke. So when you don't eat, obviously insulin comes down. So snacking, of course, means that every time you eat during the day, the insulin spikes as well. So essentially I was like, okay, so maybe going forwards, I need to just make sure that I eat foods low on the insulin index, and maybe start introducing intermittent fasting into my system, which I started doing. And I probably took it again, like I always do, to the extreme, where then having loads and loads of fat, because fat, the olive oil, nuts, avocados, eggs, they don't really spike insulin at all. And I was able to measure this when I had a continuous glucose monitor, that I was having all this lovely, nutritious Mediterranean diet, fatty foods, which is great, and didn't spike my insulin at all. But of course, there's only so much sort of fat you can have before it does actually increase your calories to an extortionate amount. And I didn't really have any carbs. And because of my genetic profile that I got assessed, that we all got to have some carbs in us in order to make lifestyle sustainable and enjoyable. So from this book, it was really eye-opening, because he basically went on to say that the reason why this model doesn't work is when you start eating less and less and less, we all notice at first a drop. And it's really exciting, because over the first month or two, you do see the number dropping on the scales. You're like, oh my God, this is working. And then it's motivation, like I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to start exercising more. And then everyone inevitably hits a plateau. And that's because that every time you eat less and less and less, your BMR, your body's very clever. It wants to conserve to make sure you don't die. So it just produces your basal metabolic rate with it. So the less you eat, the less you burn. So eventually it starts becoming counteractive, because essentially, if we were to follow that model, you're going to have to get to 0 calories and never eat again if you really want to keep losing weight, which A, will be miserable, but also incredibly dangerous and a very short life. So you get to the point where some women, I was speaking to some of my colleagues, I remember, on this same model, and they were then having 700 calories a day, and they were still not losing weight. And we're all like flummoxed, like, oh, I wonder why. But now after reading this book, I was like, that's exactly why. Because your body needs to eventually live to cause your respiratory systems, your muscles, heart muscle to keep moving and pumping. So he was saying, instead of eating less and less and less, let's actually perhaps start eating more, but more of the right stuff that doesn't spike your insulin. So actually insulin will come down. And with intermittent fasting, jury's out as to whether women should do it, etc. But I think I've settled on the fact that if you've perhaps got a past history like me, where you have had eating disorder, so your HPA, hypothalamic pituitary axis, is quite sensitive to any fluctuations in starvation or fasting or stress, that if my threshold for stress is probably a little bit lower than most people, that if I start going into a significant, long fast, that will probably switch on panic, stress and store mode, rather than actually doing some of these benefits that you hear a lot of people having, such as autophagy, which is essentially a garbage truck going around your body and removing all the useless cells. But when I met Professor Tim Spector, founder of Zoe, who's very much almost the godfather of gut microbiome, he was saying that actually from the amount of studies he's done, and I'll take his word for it, because I don't do research, but if he's telling me, the expert's telling me, I'll believe it, because he has access to thousands, 10,000, millions of data from people all over the UK and probably the world by now. And he said that overall, if you're going to fast for about 12 to 14 hours a day, that is enough to get the good benefit from it without it being insufferable. And it's true, because you finish supper about 7 and you get up and go to the gym and then maybe have breakfast at 9. That's 14 hours done. Easy. So I basically settled on that because I did go through a phase after I read his book. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to do a 3-day water fast and a 5-day water fast, and then maybe I'll just maintenance would be 18-hour fast. But I just began to get very stressed about the fact that I couldn't eat for 18 hours, and then actually I think that probably had negative effects. So really that's sort of been the journey I was on, that intermittent fasting to at least lower the insulin levels between meals, because if you're having 3 meals, that's only kind of 3 spikes during the day, whereas a lot of people in the Western diet hear these myths of have breakfast, it's good for you, and make sure you snack and have about 6 meals a day. But that's all actually not come from data or scientific research. It's all come from Kellogg's. Of course, the cereal company will want you having cereal and breakfast because it's good for you, but also the snacking industry, which pumps millions and billions in marketing and into these delicious, addictive products. They want you to snack and buy their product. So that's kind of the message that's been disseminated. And so you can't blame people for following government advice, but when you actually look at the science and the physiology and the pathophysiology behind these endocrine ailments, it makes sense. So if you're on audio mode, definitely switch to YouTube, because these are great pictures of me in a bikini. So my editor will put them in now. But essentially there's a picture of me in bikini at 1,500 calories, where I was looking great, feeling great, but just constantly hungry, trapped in this macro cycle, and really felt as if I couldn't ever jailed or chained to this app, versus then almost eating double, about 2,000, 2,500 calories, and feeling almost or looking just the same. And I suppose, wanted to use that comparison to say that if you start eating more calories, but of the right food type, and concentrate on keeping your insulin fairly low and using intermittent fasting, you can achieve the exact same results aesthetically, but just be able to live a little bit more. Because life is short to some degree, and I'm a real foodie, and I really, really enjoy food now. And now, luckily, don't feel out of control when I come across something delicious or a buffet. But I just wanted, I suppose, to say that if anyone is feeling trapped in that vicious cycle, that maybe read yourself The Obesity Code by Dr. Pfau, because it was pretty life-changing for me. So there were some sort of key notes that I wanted to finish on with this episode to just bring it all together. That ideally, don't snack because you want your insulin to reset. Double protein content. There's some data out there that shows that even if you're doubling your protein, which I suppose is more calories, but it's very lean protein, yes, you're boosting your the amount of calories you're having, but because it's going towards building muscle, it doesn't actually impact the weight gain at all. It might do for the first bit as you're absorbing more water, etc., but I've doubled my protein. I certainly haven't doubled my size. Avoid sugar where you can. I've completely cut out sugar in all the ultra-processed food, in sauces. The only sugar I have now is alcohol. But again, that's my vice, and that's the one outlet I do allow myself to have. Build muscle. Because as I said, the muscle cells are a fantastic glucose sink, and they'll just absorb a lot of it out of your blood. So if you really do want to eat more and work out less, then just build some muscle. And lastly, live a little. And what I mean by that is you've got to create a diet that's going to be sustainable. And what I mean by diet has very negative connotations, but a way of living or a healthy eating plan, like the Mediterranean diet, where you're easily satiated, you're not having these hunger pangs and sugar crashes, but also you have got to live life and go to that barbecue or have that Aperol Spritz or 3, or like I did on Pride, my espresso martinis, double vodka Red Bull. I mean, all sorts was consumed. But I can, because it doesn't happen every single day. I go for it occasionally, and that makes then the way of living sustainable for the long term. All right, we'll end it there, and I'll be back next week.